Welcome everyone back to the second session of Memorializing African American History, Cemeteries, Monuments, and Markers. Sam, do you want to go to the next slide for me? Just again, in case you're new to our workshop today, if you could keep your microphone on mute to avoid excess background noise. Know that there will be question and answer time at the end of the session, and you can post your questions in the chat space. The program is being recorded today, and recordings and slides from this workshop will be available on our website, and we will also be circulating it through our email marketing platform. Mark your calendar if you haven't already for our June 1st session on commemorating the Tulsa Massacre. You can find more details about the program on our upcoming programs page, and know that we will also be circulating more information about it through email. The session that we are about to start is going to focus on cemeteries, and our facilitators, moderators for this session will be Beverly Mills and Elaine Buck. If you want to let me have their bios in front of me, Sam, I didn't print those out. Oh, and we also want to thank the New Jersey Historical Commission for their support for this workshop and for many of our programs. We really appreciate their interest. Elaine Buck is founder of the Stoutsburg Sauerland African American Museum and a member of its advisory board. She is also a 30-year trustee of the Stoutsburg Cemetery Association, which is a historic cemetery for people of African descent located in the Sauerland Mountains in Hopewell, New Jersey. Along with her research partner, Beverly Mills, Elaine has co-authored a book entitled If These Stones Could Talk, which is based on more than a decade of research on the contribution of African Americans who lived in the Sauerland Mountain region and the surrounding area. Along with Beverly, 1804 Consultants, Grants for Sculpture in the New Jersey Historical Society and the William Trent House Museum, Elaine was instrumental in forming the Sankofa Collaborative, which is providing this program today. And she is also co-founder with Beverly of Friday True Heart Consultants, which works with K-12 teachers and staff to incorporate African American history into curricula. Beverly's bio is going to have a lot of the similar attributes as Elaine's. She is also a founder of the Stoutsburg Sauerland. They are a true partnership, let me tell you. A founder of the Stoutsburg Sauerland African American Museum and a member of its advisory board, and also a 35-year trustee of the Stoutsburg Cemetery Association. Beverly worked closely with Elaine for more than a decade to develop If These Stones Could Talk, and which comprises their research on the contribution of African American people who lived in the Sauerland Mountain and surrounding region. And you should know that their research continues. I'm sure there will be a second edition of If These Stones Could Talk, or a sequel in the coming years. Through her research, she has been able to trace her own ancestry to African Americans who were enslaved in the Hopewell Township, New Jersey area prior to the Revolutionary War. For many years, Beverly, and along with fellow trustees of the Stoutsburg Cemetery Association, presented at schools, community groups, and historic sites. And in 2017, she was part of the group that formed the Sankofa Collaborative. And of course, Beverly is also co-founder of Friday True Heart Consultants, which is bringing their research and new perspectives to K-12 education. And with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you so much. So yes, my name's Beverly Mills, and along with Elaine Buck, we would like to thank you for joining us today for our second presentation on cemeteries. So first thing, we have to just thank Linda Caldwell-Epps and Gary Schneider, who so nicely set the stage for us on our first segment. Yeah. So now for our second segment, we have to step into the past. So we're going to bring along with us Guy Weston, who will talk about how genealogy and research led to his maternal ancestors in Timbuctoo, New Jersey. We're going to also hear from Algernon Ward, who is a Revolutionary War and Civil War reenactor, who's creating awareness of a long forgotten cemetery in New Jersey's capital city. We're also going to hear from the Reverend Dr. Wanda Lundy, who will talk about how her ongoing research of over 300 free and enslaved African people are in unmarked graves in Elizabeth. So why was it necessary for our forebears to have the foresight to create these African cemeteries? So you only need to look at our American history for that answer. Segregation, Jim Crow laws throughout America. African Americans wanted to claim their right to bury their loved ones with dignity and respect. And that was how we created, our ancestors created the Stoutsburg Cemetery, which we're going to start presenting right now, which we call a proud heritage.
So we call our presentation a proud heritage. It's the African American presence in the Sauerland Mountain, but Hopewell Valley and surrounding areas. Now, the surrounding areas encompass Lambertville, the Amwells, Princeton, Trenton, Lawrenceville were all connected in our research here. And our second slide we put on there, If These Stones Could Talk. That's our book that we decided that we needed to gather the information and put it in a book. Like Linda said in the previous, in her previous presentation, when we present, I cannot tell you how many people come up to us and challenge us about slavery in New Jersey. And if we didn't have the documented history and our research and our family connections to this research, we would be in trouble because people weren't taught that. We weren't taught it at school. And right now we're still trying to include that into the historical narrative in the curriculums. But what got us started with the book was a simple phone call about a burial ground in West Amwell, which is not far from Hopewell Borough here, of a contractor that was getting ready to pave over a burial ground. And the older gentleman that called us, he knew that there were African Americans buried there. Matter of fact, he gave us some of the names of the people that are buried there. And he said Hoagland, and he said Dowdy, and started spouting off names of people that Beverly and my husband are related to, the Hoaglands. And we went to school with some of the Dowdy family. And so we got to thinking, we better go see about this. And that's what we did. We went to investigate. But before we went to investigate, I called the state cemetery board, which we are in contact with because of the Stoutsburg Cemetery. And she directed me to call the New Jersey Attorney General's office. And he directed me to have press. We had to get some press coverage in case this contractor decided he was going to desecrate that burial ground, which is illegal, but it is not uncommon for African American burial grounds to be desecrated and paved over and all the things that we're hearing. And so, and Native American burial grounds. So that's why we decided we better investigate. And once we did, lo and behold, we found out a lot of information about our own burial ground, which is only 10 miles away from this burial ground that in question. So Beverly, I'll go to the next slide.
Yeah, so we don't really know when the first burial happened at Stoutsburg. We just know it was long before the New Jersey legislation which was passed in 1884, which deemed it illegal to refuse the burial of anyone on the basis of race. And any cemetery or association or corporation could be fined up to $500. When we talked to the old timers, they said, oh gosh, no, there was another section. There was an older section, not this one. So we don't really know. It was maybe the very early 1800s. It could be, possibly a little earlier than that. But anyway, this legislation was what I was referring to, that that deemed it illegal in 1884 to discriminate on the basis of race. We'll go to the next one. So I know this is impossible for you to read, but it was really important for us to put this in here because this was the actual deed that was between Randolph Stout and his wife to Stacy Stives, Moses Blue, and Henry Lane, 3 African-American men who made sure that this purchase happened. You know, they had the wherewithal and they said, no, we're going to have a burial ground. I know that Moses Blue was very interested in having a place for his mother, Judith, who passed away. She's one of the oldest monuments we have there. There could be some that were buried earlier, but this is one that has one of the earliest stones that we could read. And this was the actual deed between the Stout family, which was a white family. They had farmland, and between these 3 African-American gentlemen who bought this property for $30. You want to go to the next and talk about that one?
And so here is a sign of our Stoutsburg Cemetery. It's located in Hopewell Township, but you could walk right across the street and it would be Montgomery Township and Somerset County. So we have right at the intersection there, 2 counties that kind of collide together. And if you're ever in the area, we ask you to please drive back down that driveway and check out some of the stones. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. I always like to say that it was really meant for bad, but it turned out to be the best place ever in Hopewell Township. It is a beautiful panoramic view of Hopewell Valley. And if you have binoculars on a clear day, you could see the Twin Towers before they got knocked down. I don't know how far you can see into New York now, but it is a beautiful space for us. And right here we have a little section that tells you it's a place and time. It's the historic Stoutsburg Cemetery. We won't read all this to you, but this was done by the Mercer County Cultural and Heritage Commission. And we have our historical markers with our Civil War veterans that are buried there. Now, when Beverly and I went to the original burial ground that we mentioned, we got to thinking, I wonder who's really buried at Stoutsburg. I mean, through the years, we've buried our families there. Beverly's mother's there, my mother's there, my son passed away, he's there, my grandparents, great-grandparents, they're buried there. And we just wondered, so we went and took a further look, and lo and behold, we found, well, we had to do a lot of research, but we found some stones that go all the way back to a memorial marker for the Revolutionary War. And like Beverly said, there's probably others there that we just don't know about because our history wasn't recorded properly.
Which includes the infamous Sylvia Dubois, who died at 120 years old.
Yes.
She's buried there. We don't know where, but it's documented that she's buried there.
Yes, and if you've never heard of her, she is in our book. We talk about her in kind of great detail because she did live in our community, and her burial was at our Mount Zion AME Church, which is our museum, our SAM museum. And so we are right now, we're putting interpretive signs with information about some of the people like Sylvia Dubois and the Civil War veterans. We do have this marker for William Stives, and Beverly, I'll let you elaborate on William Stives.
Yeah, William Stives was a Revolutionary War soldier who was with George Washington for 5 years, which was an honor. He was with the 3rd New Jersey Regiment. We don't know anything more about his background, how he came to where he came from. Was he originally from New Jersey? The trail goes cold, like with a lot of African-American history. But what we do know, he was the first African-American settler in the Sauerland Mountain region. And he vowed to live in that region when he was out, supposedly the story is, foraging for food for the army. And he came back and married this woman, Catherine, and they had 10 children and lived there. Through our research and our work, we have been able to connect white and Black descendants of William and Catherine Stives, which has been a very exciting thing for us. And we just, we love it every time we make another connection. We'll go to the next one.
And the next slide, we just have this photo of the Civil War veterans and how they were mustered out of Camp William 10. And so we have several 10 to 12 Civil War veterans that are buried at Stoutsburg Cemetery. You'll see there's the Jonathan Stives, who's related to the William Stives that we just got done talking to.
His grandson.
His grandson, and then Aaron Trueheart, who is one of Beverly's descendants. And we have Ira Bergen, who belongs to my husband, John Buck. That's his family. So when we were researching and looking at these stones and we made all of these connections, I think this Van Zandt is related to Shirley Satterfield. We just couldn't believe what we did not know. And so now we know, and we're doing some more research, but we also looked at the companies that they belong to, the 44th and the 127th, and some of the battles that they fought in. We even found information about Aaron Trueheart, and there's another one here that was at Juneteenth. And so, I mean, the information that we have in our cemeteries is just awesome. And we listed some of the battles here, and also some of them were at the procession for the funeral procession for Lincoln when he passed through. So we implore everybody to kind of know the community that you live in and some of the burial grounds, because they certainly have a history. Then we have David Bustell Bowser, that we always like to mention him. David Bustell Bowser was a Civil War flag designer because the colored troops didn't have their own flags. And of course, you know, the troops were segregated during the Civil War. And so he's the grandson of Cyrus Bustell. And Cyrus Bustell is one of the founding families for New Jersey. And he also was the bread maker for the Continental troops. So we have all these connections, but Paul Robeson was the great-great-grandson of Cyrus Bustell and also related to this David Bustell Bowser. And we just wanted to show you one of his flags that he made. And most of the flags that he made for the United States colored troops, this one is for the 127th Regiment, says, "We will prove ourselves men." That's Lady Liberty there with a veteran. And for the 127th Regiment, again, this is another one of the flags. There's not very many of them still left. I think one of them just got sold for, I don't know how much, a lot of money at an auction. And I think there's one down at the National African American Museum in Washington. So we're really proud to have this connection to our community. And then, of course, there's Paul Robeson. And for those of you that don't know him, I know him as, you know, one of the, he was certainly a civil rights activist. And then, of course, on the big screen for Showboat and singing Old Man River. And he also lived in Princeton, New Jersey. And then, of course, our one of our last slides here is our Mount Zion African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded around the 1850s and put on this location in 1899. And I do believe our Vice President Bruce Daniels is on this on the call today. And we're very proud of our museum. We made a museum out of it, Stoutsburg Sauerland African American Museum. A lot of the people that we just showed you from our cemeteries went to that church. And so that's a whole nother history in itself. And that's in Skillman on Hollow Road. And as soon as we can, we'll be open for tours. Right now, we ask you to go on our website and you can see a virtual tour. And so we'd like to end with this. And Beverly, would you just read this if you?
Yes, yeah, stories have, we always have said stories, cemeteries have stories within stories. The place of the dead must be made a school for the living. Our cemeteries, rightly selected and properly arranged, may be made subservient to some of the highest purposes of religion and human duty. They may preach lessons to which none may refuse to listen, in which all that live must hear. Truths may be there felt and taught in the silence of our meditations, more persuasive and more enduring than ever flowed from human lips. And that was from Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg. So now we are going to go to our next speaker, which will be Guy Weston. And Guy Weston has been engaged in genealogy research for over 25 years, with substantial focus on his maternal ancestors in Timbuctoo, New Jersey, where his fourth great-grandfather bought his family's plot in 1829 for $30. Wow, $30, that's, again. He is also engaged in various research and public history initiatives to raise the profile of antebellum free African Americans in New Jersey history. These have included interpretive signage in Timbuctoo, coordination of a curriculum development project in collaboration with local teachers, and preservation efforts for the Timbuctoo Cemetery, where the oldest gravestone is dated 1847. He currently serves as president of the Timbuctoo Historical Society and maintains a website which can be found at www.timbuktoonj.com. So I'm proud to now bring you Guy Weston.
Thank you so much. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I am very happy to have the opportunity to speak today because I actually live in Washington, D.C., and Timbuktu is very close to my heart. And prior to the COVID pandemic, I was up there a couple times a month. I only went back for the first time to see my mother about 2 weeks ago after not having been there for a year. And so it's these connections with various community groups to talk about our history that sort of make up for the fact that I am not personally there. I will start by describing our points of discussion for today. I have a tendency to talk very fast, so please raise your hand or put a comment in the chat if I go on too fast. But we want to talk first about where and what is Timbuktu, what is the role of our cemetery in preservation efforts, what is the history of the cemetery, and successes and challenges in our preservation efforts. I want to also acknowledge Linda Cadwell-Epps has actually been quite helpful to us in a lot of the work that we have done going back several years. Her brother-in-law was a very close friend of mine, and one day I called him and asked if he could help. He said, "No, I can't, but my sister-in-law can," not realizing who Linda Cadwell-Epps was. And I've also followed Beverly and Elaine. One thing that's good about Facebook is that even though we don't speak very often, I see what you're doing, and you often serve as examples and inspirations for me. So I wanted to begin with a quote which I don't recall. This is actually a paraphrase of something that I read once, and I can't find the source, but it says, "In addition to memorializing the deceased, African-American cemeteries are important repositories of history, genealogy, and culture that must be preserved." I think that's pretty clear to us. It's certainly clear to me, but I'm reminded of one of many horror stories about African-American cemeteries being paved over and having condos built over top of them or something that happened recently in the District of Columbia, where somebody responded to the news coverage that they didn't understand why the rights of the dead should supersede the rights of the living. So people clearly have no clue sometimes as to why cemeteries are important and how they contribute to our understanding of who we are and where we came from, and why it's important to have the preservation efforts that we are very often engaged in. I want to begin by describing Timbuctoo because so very often, even people who are from the area are unfamiliar with Timbuctoo. People who attend the local schools or teach in local schools until our efforts about 10 years ago didn't know the name Timbuctoo. Then if they knew the name, they had no idea what the history was. And that included people who actually lived in Timbuctoo. So Timbuctoo was settled beginning in 1826 by formerly enslaved and free African Americans with the assistance of Quakers. It was one of several antebellum free Black settlements in New Jersey, most of which were located in the southern part of the state. And Timbuctoo, like many of the settlements, was a stop on the Underground Railroad. This is a map of the settlements that I won't describe in great detail, but you will note that in fact, most of the settlements were in the southern part of the state. Skunk Hollow, which I guess is near Jersey City, somebody might correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that's one that was an exception. And this was also later in 1860, towards the end of slavery. Many of the ones in the South were there decades before. And then these are the people that I think about when I think about my work in Timbuctoo. These are my great grandmother and her siblings and a couple of nieces or nephews that I grew up knowing all but one of these people. But I was maybe 15 when I first heard that there was something called Timbuctoo that was part of our ancestry, but it wasn't until I was actually in my 30s that I understood the full magnitude of the stories these people would tell me when I was growing up. And I always think about them and lament the fact that they're no longer here to share what we know now. The last thing about that history is that when my mother and I inherited this property in the 1990s, we went to visit a cousin, one of the people in one of those pictures, and she was going to pass the family land on to the next generation. We knew that my great grandmother, who was born in 1902, was born there. We had no idea that it went back 3 generations before her. We certainly didn't know that the documentation of our ownership included documents like this, and we have about 18 or 20 pages like this, which are just fascinating for many reasons. Finally, I want to point out the historical context and why it is important, because when we talk about the history of free African Americans before the Civil War, it's important to note that we're not talking about so-called slave cemeteries, because even though slavery in New Jersey was complicated and an explanation of it would take more time than we have, the reality is there are many free Black people living in New Jersey before the end of the Civil War, and our cemeteries are representations and documentation of the achievements and barriers of those people, the barriers they faced in achieving their successes, their lives and their deaths, and many things that we wouldn't know if it wasn't for cemetery records. Most of the people in this room certainly don't need this reminder, but I always include the fact that New Jersey was the last northern state to pass a law outlawing slavery by gradual manumission, as most of the other states did, which meant that males born in 1804 would be indentured servants to their mother's masters until 1829 and females until 1825, because males had to serve for a longer period of time. And this is an important distinction that I never cease to be amazed by, that is always the topic of discussion when we're talking about something other than cemeteries, where we can spend more time talking about it. But essentially, if you look at the end of slavery in New Jersey by region, you will see that as far back as 1790, nearly 2/3 of Black people living in the southern counties were free, whereas only 11% in the northern counties were free, and the northern counties didn't catch up with the southern counties until probably almost 1850. Now, free certainly didn't mean without discrimination and challenges and barriers, but it did mean that we owned land, that we established institutions, that we established schools, and there is a lot of evidence of our efforts of self-determination. This is simply a map that depicts that more clearly at a particular point in time to show the extent to which the southern counties were more progressive about ending slavery than the northern counties were. And again, we're not talking so much about this history here, but I will summarize the impact of Quaker thought, Quaker influence, which is the primary reason why manumission in the South happened more quickly than it did in the northern counties. So with that in mind, let's look at the primary documentation we have of the Timbuctoo Cemetery. We know that land was purchased on December 2nd, 1854 to establish what was the Zion Wesleyan Methodist Episcopal African Church of Timbuctoo. We have the seller's name and the buyer's names. And we have the fact that the premises were to be used as a place of religious worship according to the form of government and discipline of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in America, and a place for the burial of the dead of such are in connection with said church or the descendants thereof, and basically whoever else the trustees would decide could be buried there. That is pretty clear, and that is gives us a sense of history in so many ways, because then we begin, particularly with those names, to know a lot about the people and the activities and the philosophies, if you will, that they're governed by. But unfortunately, the cemetery, the church that founded the cemetery was dissolved in the first decade of the 20th century. And the last burial was in 1922, the last documented burial, documented with the gravestone. And so in 2005, the local historical society decided it would commemorate the cemetery by spending probably $2,000 on this plaque, which everybody was happy about. But once I learned the history, such as what was written in the prior slide, I was not happy at all. Why? Because it is not a Civil War cemetery. It's an AME Zion Church cemetery. We did a geophysical survey. Hopefully that's the next slide. It's not, but it'll be one slide later. That showed that there are actually at least 79 graves in the cemetery. The vast majority of graves in the cemetery were members of the church. We know that from other documents, as well as the recital in the deed that talked about why the cemetery was established and who could be buried there. So really, U.S. colored troops were only buried there because they were members of the church, not because it was a cemetery that was dedicated specifically to U.S. colored troops. And so if you look at our geophysical survey, you'll see a couple of interesting things. The rose-colored marks with crosses on them are marked graves. The ones that are rose-colored that don't have crosses are unmarked graves. And then the green ones are basically all question marks. Some of them are graves and some of them are not. The one thing that confuses people about the physical appearance of the cemetery is that U.S. colored troops, by virtue of their military service, received free grave markers, stone grave markers at the time of their death as a benefit of military service. Whereas common, ordinary people frequently had wooden grave markers that would not survive time. So all the predominance of U.S. colored troops grave markers means is that those people got grave markers because of their military service. And the majority of the people in the cemetery who are not military had wooden markers very often, and we don't see those. And so we don't want to forget the people who are not U.S. colored troops, which are a majority. This basically reviews the recital in the deed that talks about the fact that it was an AME Zion Church cemetery and not a Civil War cemetery. This is a sign, one of our first interpretive signs that we put up, I think, in 2018, which tells the story of the Zion Wesleyan Methodist Episcopal African Church, that the land was purchased in 1854, that the oldest gravestone was from 1847, before the land was purchased, so who knows what that means. The Articles of Incorporation are also dated 1854, but one thing we have to realize about Articles of Incorporation in that period of time is that, as we see in the text of that particular document, it says something like, whereas the Congregation of Colored Persons in Timbuctoo wants to take advantage of the new law that allows for incorporation, meaning that the group existed before the incorporation date. So we know, for example, in that paragraph, which of course you can't see, we see the bishop at that time was a Christopher Russ. I was shocked to be able to find his image online. And we know the name of the pastor and the names of the trustees, which are very important. We always want to make sure that we are respectful of the Civil War history, but in this case, it actually obscures history that we want to know. One of the things that gets obscured is that even if you go on the Find a Grave website, for example, the initial transcription of grave markers didn't even include the civilian graves because they were less important, thought to be less important. It turns out that all three of the civilian graves are of the same family, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to remind you again that the oldest gravestone is 1847, 14 years before the Civil War. The deed of record is handwritten. That deed, I didn't show a picture of mine, but the current deed of record is that same handwritten one that's 150 years old. In the current county clerk's record, the owner is listed as Colored Cemetery. And so we have, as I said before, 11 surviving grave markers. 3 are US colored troops and 3 are civilians. The oldest civilian is a woman whose name is Eliza Parker. The other 2 are Matilda Parker and Frisbee Parker. So who were the Parkers? Well, who cares who the Parkers are, because they're not military, according to the emphasis of the history that is most prominent in our discussions about the cemetery before we got started about 10 years ago. It turns out that David Parker, who was one of the trustees, founding trustees, Eliza Parker was his first wife, and when she died, he married Matilda Parker, that was the second wife, and Frisbee Parker was the son of Eliza and David. And we don't even know this. Well, who was David Parker? Why did he have enough money to have a gravestone when most people had wooden grave markers? It turns out from this obituary in the New Jersey Mirror, and one thing that I am most grateful for is that we also had a newspaper in the area, the mainstream newspaper of the time, not necessarily, not a Black newspaper, not a paper that focused on Black communities. This was, the New Jersey Mirror was the newspaper of the area. And it had the death of David Parker listed, as it does many of the Black people that lived in Timbuktu going back to at least 1851. But it goes on to describe that he was an age-colored man that was a prominent person in Timbuktu, that he commanded the respect and esteem of a large number of white friends, and that he was highly regarded and very well thought of by most people in the community, and to the point that his death was basically a very big deal. Why is this an issue for me? Because we don't even know, we wouldn't even know to look for David Parker, because the Parker graves in the cemetery are ignored due to the hyper focus on the US colored troops graves. This is a picture of our cemetery, one of many pictures, and you'll see, if you could read the markers on most of those, you would see they are US colored troops. So what have our preservation efforts been as we come to a close? First was the interpretive signage. You saw one sign earlier in the presentation. There are also these 3. That other sign had the history of the church and the cemetery. The one on the right is the has a brief bio of all of the 8 U.S. colored troops. There are actually 9, but 8 that have grave markers. And there's a QR code on the sign that you can scan your phone on that will show you, take you to a website that has more detailed biographies of all of the soldiers. And it's interesting to read not only what battles they fought in, there's discussion about their families, there's references, for example, of people buried in the cemetery who don't necessarily have stones. There are biographical details, like there was one of the soldiers who was the principal of the Timbuctoo school, which was founded in 1834, but he became the director of the school after he got out of the military in 1865. There was one soldier who got out in 1865, re-enlisted in 1867, and he stayed gone until 1893 or 4. His wife didn't hear a word from him while he was gone, but he returned and she took him back. I recently, and so there are, and these are all from the pension files. The point being that there's a lot more information about these people in the pension files besides the information that's specific to their military service. So what are our other remaining preservation issues? One is that this colored cemetery reference in the county clerk's record is obviously a description that comes from probably the 60s or 50s or 40s, certainly a long time ago. They didn't know who the owner was, so that was what they put. What happened to the Zion Wesleyan Methodist Episcopal African Church? Well, to make a very long story short, this church was dissolved in the early 20th century. The denomination, of course, didn't have the infrastructure that it has today, but we are working with that denomination to acquire title to the cemetery, and we're down to, I believe, that will be done in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and we're very excited about that because that will allow us. One thing that's very interesting about doing this work is when you go to apply for a grant, somebody wants to know, well, do you have the owner's permission? Well, this is the owner in this case. We can't get the owner's permission, so we will become the owners. When we went to establish the signs, the local construction official gave us a hard time about where we would put them, and gave us a hard time about not having the owner's permission. Well, we will be the owners, and that will solve that. The second thing is, or the third thing, I guess, would be that the geophysical survey, which I didn't describe in detail, shows that grave sites extend 18 feet outside of the legal boundary, and that 18 feet is just where they stopped the survey. So we need a new geophysical survey to see how far outside the legal boundary they go, and then we'll ask the township to hopefully give us that property because it belongs to them. And then there's research related to the people that are buried in the cemetery, and I'm being reminded about the time. This is the last slide. We want to place crosses on the unmarked graves identified in the cemetery. We want to get fencing and some other aesthetic improvements, as well as genealogical and archaeological research. Community engagement is very important because elected officials and policymakers need to understand the importance of cemeteries, as I described before. This is my email address and my website. I'm very happy to come to speak to anyone who is interested in this topic. Thank you very much. And my apologies, Sam.
Thank you so much, Guy. It's wonderful to hear this presentation about all your work at Timbuctoo. I'm going to turn it over to Sam Stevens right now. He's going to read the bio for Algernon Ward, who's going to be our next speaker.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Algernon Ward is a civic activist in Trenton, New Jersey, and a friend of the William Trent House Museum, where I'm a trustee, and he has a passion for promoting and preserving the history and contributions of African Americans in our city, in our state, and the nation. He's on the board of the Trenton Historical Society, and he is a leader in the 6th Regiment United States Colored Troops Reenactors, a nonprofit living history organization educating the public about the historic military record of African Americans from the Revolutionary War, actually through World War II. And he is spearheading the effort to restore and preserve the Locust Hill Cemetery, a historic African American cemetery in Trenton, and to create an adjoining museum and community center. He has a degree in biology and was a research scientist for many years before his retirement, when he increased his civic activism and is a wonderful asset to our community. Algernon?
Good morning. Algernon Ward. And of course, as I prepared for my talk this morning, my computer took me through it. In fact, the presentation I'm going to give you is somewhat abbreviated because I had used an earlier draft, and it may not be as informative as I would like because it does not cover all the topics that I would have wanted to share with you. Do I get to share my screen?
Should be able to, but let me find you here. Oops, sorry. All right. Wait a minute. I'm looking for you. I thought I'd given you permission. Oh, I see your screen now, Algernon. Do you have it?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay, what I'm going to talk to you today about is the Locust Hill Cemetery and its origins. I should say that in Trenton, there was actually 21 cemeteries compiled by the Trenton Historic Society. Back in 1909, they did a survey of existing and previous cemeteries, and they actually located 21. And with this diagram, it kind of shows the places that cemeteries are located throughout the city of Trenton, and many of them surprising because many of the buildings and neighborhoods that we now occupy now stand on the ground of places that were cemeteries at once. This morning, we're talking about the segregated cemeteries that enclose African Americans and were buried there. I'm glad that a guy mentioned the role of the Quakers in the relationships between Blacks and the greater society, because it was in Trenton that the Quakers actually, they were the first to set aside some burial grounds as early as 1779. They reserved spaces right next to their own burial ground, next to the Friends Meeting House. People may be familiar with this house because the Friends Meeting House, because it's actually still there on the corner of Hanover Street and Montgomery Street. Right next to that is their burial ground. By the way, in that burial ground, there's 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence buried there from Trenton. And right next to that was the colored burial ground. It was about 20 feet by 40 feet long. And there was land donated by the prominent members of the Friends Meeting House. Mr. William Morris. Now that may sound familiar to her, because yes, that's the family who later went on to found Morrisville, Pennsylvania. The Friend Meeting House served as the burial ground there on the corner of Hanover and Montgomery Street. A little further in from the block, a lot of people know it now as the YWCA on Hanover Street. When that was rebuilt in 1929, they found several remains still there. in the burial site. But the story, before I leap too far ahead about Locust Hill, I should point out that there was also a burial ground at the corner of Brunswick Avenue and Paul Avenue, and it was called Gallows Hill. For obvious reasons, this was where many prisoners were executed and people who were without means were buried in that area. There was a makeshift, there was smallpox outbreak, and many of the unfortunates who passed away from smallpox were interred there at Gallows Hill, and had a small hospital that was later turned into a boarding home for the indigent. And the city of Trenton would pay Mr. Beeks, that's right, Beeks Street, Mr. Beeks, 15 cents, and he would give them breakfast and a red ticket from the city, and they would get breakfast and a place to stay overnight. But along in 18, the African Americans who were worshiping in the city of Trenton had formed a society. It was called the Society of Free African, the Society of Free Africans, and they had been the religious society of free Africans in the city of Trenton. Now, this is an interesting group because they were actually the forerunners of the Mount Zion Church. The Mount Zion Church is still located on Perry Street here in the city of Trenton, and was one of the first churches erected for African Americans. Prior to this, you should know that the Society of Free Africans worship with the Methodists. And the Methodists actually had made a space for Africans to serve, to Africans to practice religion with them as some of the first people who would admit Africans to the church. But they formed their own religious society, and this became the forerunner of the AME. One of the more notable people that was, I would have called him the head, was Mr. Sampson Peters. And Mr. Sampson Peters was a very active man. He was a cooper. He made barrels down in the southern part of the city. We know it as Bloomsbury or South Trenton now, but there is now still a Cooper Street in South Trenton, and this is where he had his shop, and this is where the Free African Religious Society would meet until the edifice of the Mount Zion was actually finished. And as they finished the church, none other than Richard Allen came over from Mother Bethel in Philadelphia and exhorted them to join the AME Church, and they converted from African Free Religious Society and became part of the AME movement that was spreading throughout New Jersey. And Sampson Peters was evangelizing throughout New Jersey to try to get the AME Church started. I understand that there's an AME Church in Hopewell and Pennington. So these are some of the places that Sampson Peters, with the help of Richard Allen, had helped to establish. And behind the Mount Zion Church, once this was established, they also had burying ground for the members of the church, which was right behind the Friends Meeting House on a block over on Hanover Street. What happened was someone, well, not someone, I'll tell you who he was. He issued a complaint that this African burial ground was beginning to be an annoyance. He called it a nuisance, with Blacks coming in and out of this burial ground. And downtown, that land had now become much more valuable. So Mr. Wright presented a petition to the residents of Hanover, on behalf of the residents of Hanover Street, and said that, it's a nuisance and that they actually passed a law that wouldn't allow anyone else to be interred there. So the members of the Mount Zion Church were presented with the dilemma: what are we going to do with people who are going to be, who pass away? We no longer have a place to bury them. It was proposed that the city of Trenton had its own burial ground, white burial ground, and it was suggested that maybe a section of that would be set aside for Blacks. Now, remember, we're talking in the early 1800s, and that was kind of a progressive thought that Blacks and whites would be buried together in the same burial ground, but that idea didn't prevail. And so a deal was made with the owner of the land out on a place called Locust Hill, which is now Hart Avenue, but at that time was called William Street. And so the congregation of the Mount Zion Church began to raise money to buy this land so that they could have a burial ground for African Americans and members of their church to lay at rest. And so, and here in 1858, the women step in, and they had a fair where they raised money to buy the African burial ground. The sale of the land on Hanover Street and behind the Mount Zion Church was sold, and the handsome sum of $1,770 was raised, and the Colored Female Association had a fall fair festival in order to raise funds to buy this burying ground. Miss Spencer Emmons and Miss Perry Hutchins were very instrumental in that. The state legislature had to grant permission to sell that land, and they did. So in 1860, they enacted a law that allowed the sale of the land and the purchase of the new Locust Hill burial ground. Locust Hill at that time was more or less a park area along Assunpink Creek. The Civil War soldiers would go out there and drill. There was a small brewery on the land, but they was seeing that it would be a good place to have a burial ground. So the trustees formed the Locust Hills Cemetery Company, purchased the land, and they began to move the bodies out of the Friends Meeting burial ground and the Mount Zion burial ground and inter them in Locust Hill. Locust Hill became the burial ground for over 140 African Americans who were buried there, and among them were 10 Civil War veterans. And I'm glad you mentioned the 127th, because the 127th was recruited mostly out of Trenton and the surrounding areas. We know Mr. William Boyer was in the 29th, and we also, the 22nd Regiment, with several are found in Timbuctoo. That's called the Most Jersey. African Americans were in the 22nd, and they, yes, indeed, accompanied President Lincoln, not only his funeral cortege, they pursued John Wilkes Booth, and they also were some of the first troops to go into Richmond and defeat the Confederacy. So Locust Hill opened for burials in 1856, and began the interments and moved them to the Locust Hill burial ground. The first recorded burial in Locust Hill was a little Richard Rose, and he was buried there in January of 1870. it appears that he died very young as a child and was buried in Locust Hill. Just for a second, there is a poem that his family wrote for him. He was 5 years old and 5 years and 7 months old, and they wrote a poem for him, and it says, "He sleeps with the cold, cold ground, dark blue skies above him. He was too good to be on earth. None know him but to love him. All is dark within our dwelling, lonely our hearts today, for the one we love so dearly has forever passed away." And he was the first published. Now, it was not often published in the newspaper for burials, so he was probably not the first person buried there, but he's the first person whose obituary was there. Now, it's a shame here because I actually got the rest of the slides finally loaded onto a stick that I could put on a computer and continue to talk with some ground penetrating radar images that we have found in the cemetery and some contemporary views of what happened at the cemetery. Long story short, shortly after the turn of the century, when most of the trustees at the Mount Zion Church and the Locust Hill Cemetery Company began to pass away, the wooden fence around the Locust Hill Cemetery began to deteriorate from lack of maintenance. And in that particular time, a fallen fence is very good for burning in your furnace. So people began to pilfer the wood and use it in their houses to burn. And wasn't long before it became overgrown and disused, and the headstones began to topple. The local boys would go out and play baseball in there. In fact, they call it the Locust Hill Field, and would play baseball there, and began to fade from the memory of the people who lived in the area. Not everyone.
Algernon, you have about 5 minutes.
Okay.
I'm giving you the 5-minute warning.
The 5-minute warning. Okay. From time to time, people would make efforts to try to keep the place going. It would be published in the newspaper in 1919 that this cemetery was falling into disrepair. And so the local union had a fundraiser and tried to raise money to try to erect a new fence and have the work done on it. But over time, it began to fade in the memory of the people in the area. And in fact, an open field is an invitation for people to dump, and even the city started dumping ashes on what they considered an open field, and then desecrating that burial ground. Later in 1946, someone challenged the city that this was no longer being used as a burial ground, and the city of Trenton actually sold part of the cemetery to the Philadelphia Freight Company, who built a freight garage there and used it all the way up into the 70s. I got involved I was on Hart Avenue registering voters, and one of the ladies, Ms. Ethel Wilkins, told me that, there's a burial ground over here right next to my house. And she talked about when she was a child, how they would find bones after heavy rains or floods. And I actually asked Councilman Nate Walker at the time, could he look into it? The city came back and said, we didn't have any records of a burial ground. And they looked further and then found, in fact, there was there. So the city has gone about the business of designating it as a burial ground. They erected a fence, and we're working on restoring the historic nature of the burial ground, and then opening a museum at 73 Hart Avenue. So the Locust Hill Cemetery is the largest remaining segregated burial ground in the city of Trenton. We do have a list of names, and we do have a list of the Civil War veterans who are buried there. The community has enthusiastically taken up the cause to bring this back, and I'm privileged to work on this project to bring back the Locust Hill Cemetery and open a museum to interpret the lives of the people who are interred there. Remembering that the Mount Zion Church, being the first free African church in the city of Trenton, most of the members of the church were prominent African Americans of the time, and so the history is very rich with the contributions of the people who are buried in Locust Hill. So thank you very much, and I wish I could have shared more of the images that I have with you, but of course, technology seems to hate me when it always fails right before my presentations. And I don't know, I'm vexed like that, but we'll get through it.
Thank you.
But I just want to point out, what you see behind me is the image of the drawings of the Locust Hill Cemetery and how it's going to be incorporated into the Aspen Pink Greenway project. And these are the conceptual drawings that we have that we are working on at the very moment. And I'd be happy to answer any questions along this line.
Thank you so much, Algernon. Your work with Locust Hill is paying off so well, and that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. We're going to go to Elaine Buck is going to read the bio for Reverend Dr. Wanda Lundy, who will be our final speaker on cemeteries. And I encourage all of you to please stay on the line. We're going a little long, but we encourage you to please stay. Right now, we don't have any questions in the chat, so we'll be able to use all of our time for Reverend Lundy's presentation. Elaine? You're muted.
I need the bio up on the screen if you could.
I don't know if we have that. I can just read it if you'd like.
If you could, I appreciate it.
Okay. Reverend Dr. Wanda Lundy. She is currently engaged in research of 313 plus free and enslaved African people buried in unmarked graves in the Siloam Hope First, which is Old First Baptist Presbyterian Church in Elizabeth, New Jersey cemetery, with the goal of establishing a monument to honor and remember their contributions to the story of First Presbyterian Church and Elizabeth, New Jersey. Lundy, an ordained Presbyterian minister, has 33 years of pastoral, institutional, and academic ministry experience. She is the recently elected moderator of the newly formed Northeast New Jersey Presbytery. Her travel venues include Cuba, Brazil, Israel, Ethiopia, Ghana, Nigeria, Honduras, Senegal, and Korea. She is married to Curtis Lundy, a jazz musician, and has 2 children, Love and Lukman. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing that correctly. And she has a very extensive educational background, from a BA from Alabama, an MA from Howard, and a divinity, interdenominational theological center degree, and also one from New York Theological Seminary, and a PhD student. There's so much. But anyway, I now present Reverend Dr. Wanda Lundy. Thank you.
Blessings, my siblings.
Yeah.
Please join me in a moment of silence to honor our ancestors. I'd like to also honor our Queen Mother Mentor, Linda Caldwell Epps, for bringing us together to call the names and tell the stories of our ancestors. We honor you, Queen Mother Mentor Linda Caldwell Epps, for the work you are doing. I'm sharing a video developed for the National Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Society conference held this past October. It gives a summary of the work we are doing in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Blessings, and thank you for the opportunity to introduce the African ancestors, men, women, and children who lived in Elizabeth, New Jersey, beginning in 1664. Elizabethtown, established in 1664, was the first English-speaking settlement in New Jersey and the first seat of colonial government for the state. The province's first appointed governor, Philip Carteret, arrived in the region on the ship Philip in 1664 and stepped ashore at Elizabethtown beside the Arthur Kill, a tidal strait separating New Jersey from Staten Island. From the very beginning, European settlers used and depended upon enslaved African labor force to work their plantations. Governor Carteret and his 12 followers arrived with 18 African men servants, slaves, because they added value to their land grants. Governor Carteret also brought with him the concessions and agreement of the Lords Proprietors of New Caesarea, New Jersey, which was the constitution governing the establishment of New Jersey. The document was important to the introduction of African slaves into East Jersey. The original 84 English families settling in the region were encouraged to bring servants and slaves, with offers of an additional 150 acres for each slave and 75 acres for weaker servant slaves more than 14 years old. Bonded servants could get 75 acres after their bonded servitude ended. This is found in Union County Black Americans, FOM, Washington. As you can hear, documented in Union County Black Americans by Ethel Washington, our ancestors were here from the beginning of the establishment of New Jersey. Also, take note of the fact that the more enslaved Africans the European settlers brought, the more land they were given. The church I serve as pastor of is Siloam Hope First Presbyterian Church. This is a recently merged congregation that includes First Presbyterian Church. To give you further context, I'll now show you a short video about the church campus that includes the cemeteries where our ancestors now rest.
Welcome back to Jersey Matters. We're taping on a rainy day in Lakewood, New Jersey. Hey, did you know that Elizabeth, not Trenton, was the first capital of New Jersey? And it wasn't named after Queen Elizabeth, but Elizabeth Carteret, who was a wealthy landowner in colonial times. That city has so much history. And now our Vanessa Tyler reveals a bit of history that many thought would stay buried.
Larry, there is so much history in plain sight, often overlooked, like this graveyard behind the First Presbyterian Church on Broad Street in Elizabeth. Here lies those who shaped New Jersey and the spirit of America.
This is the most historic cemetery in the state of New Jersey.
The headstones here prove it. Time may have worn away many names. Walking through this graveyard is like walking through history. On this day, a tour of the cemetery and the bold-faced names of history. There are others here, not so famous, but whose lives are just as valuable to be remembered.
Please join me in welcoming Sean Brown.
It all started with a curious Sean Brighty, a Brown University student who began with a class project on genealogy and ended up going deeper into the ground.
I combed through all of the records from 1840 to 1902.
On the grounds of the Presbyterian Church behind the cemetery in the equally historic Snyder Academy building, an audience invited by the Old First Historic Trust, the organization that oversees the grounds here. Sean told them what he learned as he was trying to find the plots of his own family members buried in that centuries-old cemetery. His research into the church's old burial records unveiled 5,000 bodies buried, and about 2,000 markers are here. But what is really surprising, over in the far corner, chained off in the segregated section called the island, records show graves are missing.
That hundreds of these unmarked African-American burials lie in that corner under what's now the church parking lot.
What Sean uncovered was many of the graves are well covered, paved over by a driveway. The area built up around it includes the Union County Courthouse and a multi-story garage. Here lies early African Americans, both slave and free.
You get individuals who actually own substantial amounts of property, which is very rare for an African American of the mid-19th century. The cemetery itself goes back to the late 1600s, but the earliest marked African American grave we have is 1840. And there are only 5 marked African American graves out of the over 350 African American individuals buried there. Is the stone for Lafayette Boylston, the one that actually labels him as colored, which is really what started the whole examination of this part for me.
Just the sheer number of unmarked graves, that some of those really might still be under the current driveway. And that was really, really surprising. So we do hope that we will have the funding available over the near future to be able to memorialize some of those people who are unmarked and not named, but we'd like to do that.
Well, I didn't realize that here at the Presbyterian Church in Elizabeth, New Jersey, that there was a large number of African Americans who were church members, worshiped, and are buried on the grounds here. And that we can honor them and hopefully look for a way of honoring them, and that when you call their names, they're remembered. The stories do not continue to be told, and it's so exciting that this young man has taken the time and brought forth this information that we can now honor those who are unnamed and those who have been a part of these communities.
As for Sean, he started the project looking for his relatives.
I found my family in the book originally.
Last name Tuckers, some listed as Tukers.
I have a family connection to Elizabethtown. My ancestors actually were some of the original founders.
So it appears he continues his family line of discovery. In Elizabeth, I'm Vanessa Tyler for Jersey Matters.
I'm standing in the location our ancestors had to worship from. They worshiped the balcony that was designated for them. Enslaved and free Africans were members of congregations. According to church manual, 20 Black members in 1824, 39 years before Emancipation Proclamation. And later manuals show that more than 60 joined over the next year. This information is found in church manuals dated 1824, 1858, 1868. Ancestors were buried in the cemetery. I've been told that some of our ancestors were active with their owners. The only gravestone is dated 1849 that signifies that an ancestor is buried in the cemetery. And it has the abbreviation COL''D in the corner of the stone, signifying this person was colored. Alexander Hamilton attended school at the academy on our campus. This is the academy that Alexander Hamilton went to school at when he came to the United States. Record states that he walked in the cemetery between classes studying on this campus, that he was often seen sitting under a tree in the cemetery. This could have been the tree. This tree is over 300 years old. Surely our ancestors were an eyewitness to these accounts. What might they have been doing? We know the story of Alexander Hamilton. We want to tell the story of ancestors. I'm buried where most of our ancestors are buried in unmarked graves. It was almost exactly 1 year to the day ago in October 19th, 2019, at a 4 Centuries in a Weekend event sponsored by the Union County Office of Cultural and Heritage Affairs, I was introduced to the ancestors who are resting in the cemetery in Elizabeth, New Jersey. In thinking of the focus of the conference, rituals of resistance, evidence of resiliency, faith in the time of COVID-19 and resistance, it is my strong belief that the resistance and resiliency of our ancestors interred in the cemetery at First Presbyterian Church is their determination that they not be forgotten. That is what I believe their resistance and their resiliency is. They want their names called. They don't want to be forgotten. And I also believe that they want to help us to do the work that we are called to do today. So what we have been doing over the last month is working on a monument, a design of a monument that will go in this very spot to remember, to honor our ancestors. And it is my pleasure to show that to you today. We invite you to join us as we remember our ancestors and as we listen as the ancestors speak. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. We invite you to journey with us every Sunday. We have begun our studies and our research. This summer, we plan to continue, actually began in a serious research effort. We have applied for 2 grants, a research grant and also a grant to begin to build the monument. But each Sunday on a video blog called What's the 313, The Ancestors Speak, we have begun to do the study, prepare ourselves for the work that needs to happen to identify over 313. We have 117 of the names. Some of the names we have the first name, some of the names we have the last name, some of the names are unnamed. But our effort is to identify additional names. There are potentially 384 persons who are buried in the cemetery. There's a lot of work, research that needs to be done. So we invite you to join us. We especially think, I called her, and I call her Queen Mother Mentor because she is our mentor. She is teaching us
And I think the ancestors are also mentoring us and teaching us. If we listen to us, they're bringing resources to help us to know what we need to do and how we need to do it. And I think that if we work together, that we can do what we're called to do. So thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Lundy. This was a wonderful presentation, and we really appreciate all the work that you're doing in Elizabeth with this, with all your work with the cemetery. We do have a question that has been posted from Galene Vanderhoof, and the question is, I need help. I am a university adjunct and researcher. 6 months ago, I discovered my family owned and cleared in the 18th century more than 5,000 acres of New Jersey, including the entire town of Cedar Grove, all clearing done by hand of millions of trees in a 1-to-1 ratio of family members and enslaved persons. Cedar Grove has 5 extant family houses that enslaved people built and resided, and our family cemetery, National Historic Designated, in parentheses, where numerous enslaved people are buried. When informed of my research, the town refused to accept it without proof. The local historic society is afraid to acknowledge my research for fear of losing operating subsidy. Our farm existed from 1711 to 1810. The town's history conveniently begins in 1870. How can I get them to acknowledge their past? I put that open to anyone that would like to give her some advice.
This is Linda. Hi, I was just sending her a note to tell her we did receive her email. Beverly, if you remember, I passed it on, and we thought we would maybe get some pointers from today on how to help you, but we do plan on responding to you via email. We're just really appalled at what's going on there and have made some preliminary contacts to try and help you out, but I'd rather have that conversation offline with you. Hopefully
Great.
that's okay.
It's fine. I'm a he.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So no, I didn't forget you. I'm so sorry. We were so busy planning for today, but we were all very upset by the email that you sent. And we certainly have not forgotten you, and we'll try and see what we can do to help.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So I do believe that this is the time that we are going to be taking our lunch break, and we're going to resume again at 1:30. Am I correct, Sam?
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll see everybody back at 1:30.
Okay.
Thank you all.